In late 1968 and mid-1969, the outskirts of Vallejo, California, were hunting grounds. A predator operated in the shadows, targeting couples in isolated areas. This August 1969 FBI teletype logs the initial timeline. A young couple was murdered near Vallejo around Christmas 1968, followed by a second attack on a couple during the 4th of July 1969. Investigating officers found no clear motive for the violence. As the Bureau noted in their files, these attacks remained unsolved to date, quickly turning into cold cases. At this stage, the killer was a localized threat, striking in remote areas without leaving a name. That changed when he decided to seek a broader audience. In August 1969, the killer shifted his strategy. He began a direct campaign to dominate the local headlines. He mailed anonymous letters and segments of a 3-part cipher to 3 major regional newspapers: the San Francisco Examiner, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. This August 6th, FBI Airtel records the delivery. In these letters, the writer claimed credit for the Vallejo murders and demanded front-page coverage. He officially introduced himself by writing, "Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking." Vallejo and San Francisco police processed the paper for fingerprints, but the surfaces yielded no identifiable prints. Forensic analysis reached an immediate limit. Without local physical leads, authorities transferred the evidence to the FBI laboratory and the Identification Division. By late 1969, the investigation had grown from a local tragedy into a psychological game, with federal resources now dedicated to the hunt. The letter-writing campaign didn't signal an end to the violence. In September 1969, the Zodiac moved his activity to a new location. This FBI report confirms a daylight assault on September 27th at Lake Berryessa in Napa County. The attack resulted in the stabbing death of Cecilia Ann Shepard. 2 weeks later, on October 11th, the killer changed his tactics again. He left the rural lakes for the densely populated Presidio Heights neighborhood in San Francisco. He shot a taxi driver, Paul Lee Stein, at point-blank range. This murder moved the investigation from the outskirts of the Bay directly into the city streets. By operating in an urban center, the Zodiac increased his visibility to witnesses and his risk of leaving evidence behind. That urban attack resulted in the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. Unlike the clean letters sent to the press, the San Francisco crime scene contained physical, biological evidence. San Francisco police processed the taxicab and recovered 30 latent fingerprints, 3 palm prints, and a lower joint impression. This police memo identifies the most critical find: fingerprints on the right front door handle that were etched in blood. Investigators were certain these prints belonged to the killer. The FBI Identification Division now had a specific forensic profile to use against their list of suspects. Federal and local agencies began a massive screening process, comparing these blood-stained prints and the earlier handwriting samples against thousands of leads. In Vallejo, police targeted specific individuals for testing. This letter to the FBI director shows them submitting a suspect's employment applications to see if the handwriting matched the Zodiac's letters. This October 6th report shows the systematic elimination of leads, including a suspect born in Texas. The FBI concluded his prints were not identical to the evidence from the crime scenes. By October 29th, the Identification Division completed a major audit of the bloody prints from the San Francisco taxi. They did not match the victim, nor did they match any of the primary suspects under investigation. Leads continue to arrive from across the country.
Describes a tip from Atlanta regarding a Los Angeles man whose voice allegedly matched a caller on a televised program featuring attorney Melvin Belli. Despite the reach of multiple state and federal agencies, the investigation never produced a confirmed match for the physical evidence. The Bureau's final reports summarize the results of the 1969 hunt. Every fingerprint comparison ended with the same phrase: no identifications affected. The FOIA files remain a record of dead ends, hundreds of pages detailing cleared suspects whose names are now hidden behind heavy redactions. The 1969 investigation left behind a singular outcome. The Bureau held his handwriting, his ciphers, and his bloody fingerprints, yet the identification never happened. The Zodiac's escalation in the fall of 1969 provided investigators with an abundance of physical evidence. 50 years later, that evidence remains the only trace of a killer who simply disappeared.
In late October 1969, the San Francisco mail system became a delivery mechanism for a specific type of terror. A serial killer was on the move, and he was using the U.S. Postal Service to ensure the entire city was watching his every move. This FBI memorandum from the time notes that the killer had recently sent an anagram directly to the press, challenging authorities to decode his message. Newspapers like the Chronicle had evolved into operational tools for the killer. By printing his ciphers under the threat of further violence, the press became a required participant in his game. The Zodiac was engineering a psychological war. He used the reach of the media to force the general public into the role of active participants in a high-stakes manhunt. To break the stalemate, local California police departments turned to the FBI's Identification Division in Washington, D.C., the centralized clearinghouse for forensic evidence. This official report from October 31st details the Bureau's attempt to analyze latent fingerprints, invisible marks of oil or sweat, pulled from extortion letters mailed to the Vallejo Times-Herald. Local police fed Washington a steady stream of prime suspect names, but the verdict from the lab is recorded in cold, bureaucratic terms. The prints found on the letters did not match the men in custody. Furthermore, the FBI noted they had no baseline palm prints on file, preventing a complete comparison. Without that baseline data to compare against, the forensic tools of 1969 could only go so far. Despite the centralized scientific effort, the FBI remained empty-handed. As the murders continued, individual police departments across Northern California began filing their own direct requests for federal assistance. On October 31st, Vallejo Police Chief Jack E. Stiltz sent this formal request to Washington, asking for federal fingerprint checks against a specific local suspect. Director J. Edgar Hoover oversaw the mobilization of his agency to support these local requests, turning the FBI into a processing hub for 3 counties. The federal net also had to account for evidence from Napa County following an assault at Lake Berryessa. This November 5th report logs victims Cecilia Ann Shepard and the resulting investigation. But the results followed the same pattern. The latent impressions from the crime scene ruled out the local suspect. Vallejo, Napa, and San Francisco were all pulling physical evidence from their own jurisdictions and funneling it to a single federal choke point. This hub-and-spoke model meant local jurisdictions were dependent on Washington to connect the dots across county lines. Despite the coordination, the lab results consistently ruled out their best leads. The investigation moved as fast as a 1969 paper trail would allow. Field offices and headquarters traded intelligence via teletypes, working to stay ahead of a killer who moved between jurisdictions in hours. This teletype illustrates the urgency of the hunt, flagging suspects living in the immediate vicinity of the latest murder site, and warning agents that they were armed and dangerous. To overcome the delay of the mail, the San Francisco office suggested handing a suspect's fingerprint card directly to the captain of the first nonstop commercial flight departing Washington. An FBI agent would then wait at the terminal in San Francisco to intercept the pilot and retrieve the evidence as soon as the plane landed. Law enforcement was forced to fight a fast-moving, modern killer using physical paper and commercial flight schedules. The friction of the era's bureaucracy was a constant vulnerability. While the FBI cleared suspect after suspect, the killer continued to utilize the postal system to maintain his presence in the public consciousness. This November 12th document from the San Francisco Police Department outlines a significant increase in the evidence. The Chronicle had received 2 new communications on consecutive days, a 7-page letter and a separate 3-page letter. The sheer volume of the Zodiac's correspondence gave investigators more physical evidence to test, yet it also highlighted how easily he could operate without being detected. With fingerprint analysis failing, San Francisco police formally requested the FBI cryptographic section intervene. They needed the Bureau to compare these new letters with a cipher submitted earlier, searching for a pattern in the killer's code. By mid-November, despite the use of air-mailed evidence and cryptographic analysis, the lab results remained the same. This teletype confirms that once again, the latent fingerprints were not a match. These files show the full weight of 1969 forensics, from fingerprint labs to cryptographic sections, operating at full tilt for a month. Yet, after the coordinated cross-country checks and the air-mailed evidence, the Zodiac remained a ghost.
invisible to the era's best scientific tools.
The Zodiac had escalated from rural lovers' lanes to murdering a cab driver in the heart of the city, placing immense pressure on the SFPD homicide detail to close the case. To catch him, investigators had to rely on the only physical evidence he carelessly left behind: latent fingerprints, palm prints, and impressions of his lower finger joints pulled from the crime scenes. Yet forensic science in the 1960s had a severe limitation. Before digitized, searchable databases existed, a fingerprint was virtually useless on its own. To make a match, police had to provide the lab with a specific suspect's name to manually check against the physical files. Looking at this declassified FBI file, we can see how the SFPD cast a massive, desperate net. Relying on highly confidential informants, they forwarded lists of potential suspects to Washington. Section 3 of the FBI's Zodiac files reveals exactly who the police believed the killer was. It exposes the psychological profiles they built in their attempt to trap a phantom. On November 28th, an urgent request arrived at the FBI's Identification Division. An SFPD inspector, acting on confidential tips, submitted a specific list of suspects for fingerprint comparison. Reading this memo, the SFPD's first major profile becomes clear: all veterans and white male Americans. The sheer volume is striking. Dozens of names and birth dates fill the page, all completely redacted to protect those caught in the dragnet. On the second page, the inspector introduces a more disturbing profile criteria. He explicitly notes the listed individuals have had some serious mental problem and were suggested as suspects based on this documented psychiatric history. The SFPD targeted a specific intersection of traits: military training paired with documented psychological instability. This profile defined a suspect who was both highly lethal and dangerously unpredictable. While some men were flagged because they fit those broad psychological profiles, other memos targeted specific individuals residing right across the bay in San Francisco and San Rafael. By early December, the back and forth escalated. Looking at this encrypted teletype, the urgent routing tag shows the pressure mounting. Toward the bottom, the FBI applied a stark warning to these local suspects: armed and dangerous. These internal communications prove police believed the killer was highly lethal and operating right under their noses, needing those forensic checks cleared immediately. The actual processing of that physical evidence took place nearly 3,000 miles away, inside the FBI's latent fingerprint section in Washington, D.C. Looking at this latent fingerprint section worksheet, we see the manual reality of 1969 forensics. Agents had to physically log incoming suspect lists, walk into the stacks to pull master files, and visually compare inked cards against crime scene lists. But they quickly hit a severe technical hurdle: a forensic data gap. A standard 10-digit FBI fingerprint card only records the fingertips. It did not capture the palm prints or lower joints, the exact impressions the Zodiac left behind. The forensic system was inherently misaligned at the evidence. Even if the SFPD handed the FBI the real killer's name, the Bureau often lacked the specific, obscure prints required to actually confirm the match. In early December 1969, the FBI director delivered the final verdicts back to San Francisco. Reviewing this official report, the overarching result for the highly confidential suspects is definitive. The latent prints were, quote, not identical with fingerprints of 18 individuals, and the forensic data gap explicitly thwarted the rest of the work. Another memo states flatly that the impressions of the lower joint areas and palm prints of the suspects were, quote, not contained Identification Division files. The investigation was left with a sea of redacted, cleared names, and a complete lack of actionable scientific leads. By late 1969, the investigation hit a wall between the SFPD's profiles and the FBI's files. Despite the tailored military records and the targeted local suspects, the era's forensic limitations completely neutralized every single lead. The physical evidence confirmed that the Zodiac remained an invisible presence, protected by the technical disconnects of his time. In the early 1970s, California was gripped by the Zodiac Killer's active terror campaign. The resulting flood of tips from the public created a massive administrative burden for law enforcement, forcing the FBI to process an overwhelming number of potential suspects. Section 4 of the FBI's Zodiac files documents this grueling reality. It serves as a chronological record of the Bureau's attempts to systematically investigate and eliminate leads, one name at a time. A notable lead arrived in August 1970. An officer with the Fairfield Police Department flagged a suspect with a military background who had been born in Chicago, providing his military serial number for a federal background check. The lead stalled just a week later. The FBI laboratory compared the man's prints to Layton's recovered from the crime scenes and concluded they were not identical. In this era, the FBI was entirely dependent on perfect physical matches. Without absolute forensic alignment, investigators were forced to release highly suspicious individuals as they lacked the legal or scientific grounds to hold them. By October 1970, the Zodiac began sending postcards to the San Francisco Chronicle, escalating his media taunts and providing new opportunities for forensic analysis. However, interagency evidence sharing hampered the investigation. Instead of the original postcard, the FBI laboratory only received secondary photocopies. Analysts noted that a comparison was not feasible. Without original pen strokes and pressure marks, their handwriting techniques were useless. This lack of access to original artifacts effectively sidelined the FBI's best document examiners. By the time evidence reached federal hands in a reproduced format, the physical data required for a match had already been stripped away. In November 1970, the FBI began routing the Zodiac's complex ciphers away from field offices. Evidence like Q59 through 61 was forwarded directly to the specialized cryptanalysis section of the laboratory. In the 1970s, cryptanalysis was a slow, manual process. Evidence often entered a bureaucratic black box, where it remained for months while specialists performed mathematical evaluations to determine the validity of the codes. This fragmentation meant that different divisions were working in isolation. With fingerprints, handwriting, and ciphers processed by separate silos, the Bureau struggled to integrate these findings into a single, cohesive profile of the killer. In January 1973, a new lead surfaced involving a suspect stationed at the Sierra Army Depot in Northern California. A CID investigator reported that a source had overheard this suspect discussing the murder of an unknown female. Agents noted a physical resemblance between the suspect's photograph and the artist's conception of the Zodiac Killer. This SFPD wanted poster provided the visual baseline for the comparison, featuring both the original and amended drawings of the primary suspect. The FBI attempted to cross-reference this man's fingerprints and handwriting against several historical files, including evidence from an unsolved 1966 murder in Riverside. In March 1973, the laboratory returned a frustrating result. The suspect's fingerprint card signatures were inadequate for comparison. The lab suggested a difficult workaround. Agents needed to obtain new samples from the suspect using the exact wording of the original Zodiac letters. Even when investigators identified a suspect with motive and a physical resemblance, the rigid requirements of 1970s forensics created a bottleneck. Without high-quality baseline samples, the investigation remained stalled at the laboratory level. By August 1974, the FBI lab began processing a new set of evidence connected to a man in Cleveland. The Bureau received 4 sheets of the suspect's known writing, along with a drawing of the Zodiac symbol. The lab's primary conclusion was inconclusive. They stated it was not definitely determined whether the Zodiac letters were prepared by this individual. Citing a lack of significant characteristics in the samples, the report notes that the man could not be definitely eliminated as a possible suspect. With no further value seen in collecting more samples, the FBI's final advice was to consider other suspects. These Section 4 files demonstrate a systemic bottleneck in 1970s forensics. In an era before digital cross-referencing, the investigation often ended in a bureaucratic purgatory, leaving potential suspects indefinitely categorized as not eliminated. By the early 1970s, the Zodiac Killer vanished from the streets of San Francisco, leaving behind a terrified public and cold crime scenes.
Overwhelmed by a mountain of tips and taunting correspondence, local California police departments turned to the FBI for federal assistance. This clipping from the FBI files details critical evidence. On December 20th, 1969, the killer sent a Christmas note to attorney Melvin Belly, including a blood-stained scrap of victim Paul Stein's shirt to prove its authenticity. The killer explicitly stated his mental state, writing, "I am afraid I will lose control again." Reviewing this, Dr. Lawrence Friedman provided a psychological profile describing a suspect overwhelmed with terror and driven by savage rage. This analysis established the baseline the Bureau would use to treat the manhunt as a psychological chess match. Throughout the mid to late 1970s, agents systematically investigated individuals who matched the killer's known timeline. This June 1975 FBI teletype outlines a prime suspect, described as a direct look-alike for the composite sketch. His military service placed him in the San Francisco Bay Area and Riverside during the murders, and near Patterson during a later incident. 2 years later, an Airtel flagged a suspect from Cordelia, California. The report noted he met the physical profile, had severe sexual hang-ups, and possessed military cryptographic training. A 1979 report identified another suspect as an escaped convict who was verified to be at large throughout the duration of the Zodiac killings. Despite multiple suspects matching the locations and methods of the killer, the investigation remained stalled without undeniable physical proof. To find that proof, the FBI laboratory dedicated years to physical clues, painstakingly processing fingerprints and handwriting samples across thousands of pages. But the crime scene data repeatedly came back empty. When agents cross-referenced latent prints from the evidence against these prime suspects, the lab consistently reported no fingerprint record located. The written correspondence offered similar frustrations. An analysis of 16 folders of Zodiac letters revealed a wide range of variation in writing speeds and styles. The examiners deduced the killer wasn't writing naturally, suggesting he disguised his penmanship to thwart investigators. Because the killer lacked comparable known standards and likely distorted his writing, the FBI's best physical leads resulted in a permanent stalemate. As the 1980s began, the investigation's main problem transitioned from a lack of evidence to a paralyzing overabundance of noise. The case files became bloated with false leads and internal complications. This May 1981 memo outlines a devastating blow. The original lead investigator, Inspector David Toschi, forged the 1979 Zodiac letters himself. He wrote them to generate additional publicity, compromising the integrity of the remaining files. This bulleted list of factual discrepancies shows how amateur sleuths further wasted resources by submitting cipher solutions that fundamentally misunderstood the weapon types and victims involved in the actual crimes. Internal police forgery, combined with relentless public interference, created an environment where the truth was inseparable from the myth. By 1984, the Section 5 files document a quiet, strategic internal shift rather than a final arrest. According to this 1984 Airtel, the Bureau began forwarding their compiled Zodiac data to the newly formed Behavioral Science Unit to assist with ongoing cases like the Green River murders. The behavioral and geographic patterns of the Zodiac were actively repurposed, helping investigators codify the techniques used in modern criminal profiling. While the Zodiac files record a failure to catch a specific killer, they expose the forensic limits of the 1970s, limitations that drove law enforcement to develop the behavioral techniques used in criminal profiling today. By the late 1980s, the trail of the original Zodiac killer had been cold for decades, but the FBI was still being haunted by his legacy, actively tracking extortionists who used the name to terrify their targets. In March 1986, an extortion letter arrived in Los Angeles. Despite the passage of time, the author signed it Zodiac Killer. Then, in February 1988, a second attempt targeted the McDonald's Corporation in Atlanta. This envelope contained graph paper and a hand-printed letter that opened with the killer's signature greeting, followed by printed cutouts describing the Chinese zodiac. But the laboratory examination identified clear discrepancies. Because the writing and terminology failed to match the 1960s evidence, the FBI concluded that no definite association could be established between these cases.
To narrow down the search, the Bureau tracked a suspect in Mount Vernon, New York, who bore a striking resemblance to the original composite sketch from the 1969 murders. The core dilemma was clear. Investigators had to determine if they were chasing a wave of harmless pranksters or if the original killer was beginning to evolve his methods. The mystery deepened in April 1988. A 6-page threatening letter surfaced in New Canaan, Connecticut, and this time it contained a genuine cryptographic puzzle. The FBI cryptanalysis lab made a chilling discovery. The author had used the exact same substitution system as the original Unsolved Zodiac ciphers. However, the author failed to replicate the original killer's precise geometry. While the 1960s Zodiac letters used a perfect 17-column rectangle, this writer used only 13 columns, resulting in uneven lines that broke the established pattern. The FBI cracked the code. Specimen Q2's plaintext claimed a victim must die for her 50 megahertz screech. In Specimen Q5, the author challenged the Bureau directly, stating they would have to put some effort into it. The FBI traced the letter to modern Conqueror brand paper and Schaefer-Eaton watermarks. Because these materials were not found in the original case files, the lab identified the author as a highly dedicated copycat. While the FBI successfully broke the codes, these sophisticated imitators functioned as noise, distracting investigators from the true forensic pursuit of the murderer. In January 1991, the Vallejo Police Department decided to cut through the distractions. They officially reopened the original investigation, moving the focus away from documents and toward the physical evidence of latent fingerprints. They tracked a new suspect with a history of sex offenses who fit a specific profile from the killer's later communications, a man born in 1924 who was Jewish. They also turned back to the case's most notorious suspect, Arthur Lee Allen. The FBI documents confirm that Allen was the primary suspect when the murders first occurred in the late 1960s. To settle the matter, the Sacramento FBI ordered a massive forensic sweep. They requested that every latent fingerprint ever developed in case A1042 be pulled for a direct comparison against both suspects. This was the final pivot of the investigation. Decades of circumstantial profiles were finally being weighed against the definitive evidence of the fingerprints themselves. After a massive comparative effort, on March 29, 1991, the latent fingerprint section finally delivered the definitive results of the forensic sweep. For the unnamed suspect, the findings were clear. 37 latent fingerprints previously reported in the case were not a match. The results were the same for Arthur Lee Allen. 38 latent fingerprints definitively did not match his ridge patterns. 1 month later, a final memorandum from Sacramento concluded that the reinvestigation had failed to produce significant new information. Sacramento officially ceased their investigation. Despite the dead ends, the file remained open, with the subject still officially classified as armed and dangerous. Even with cracked codes and crime suspects, the biometric evidence left the case at a standstill. The identity of the Zodiac remained unknown, leaving the file as a permanent ghost in the FBI's machine. It's late 2017. 50 years have passed since the Zodiac's first murders in Northern California. But inside the FBI's cryptanalysis lab at Quantico, a single email is about to trigger a high alert status. On September 22nd, a television producer sends a startling message. They claim to possess the solution to an unsolved Zodiac cryptogram. The Bureau handles the potential solution as active homicide evidence, a possible lead in a string of open murders. Cold cases of this magnitude never truly close in the FBI's eyes. A single pitch from a TV production company can instantly force federal authorities back into an active evaluation mode. Over the decades, local law enforcement submitted 4 total Zodiac ciphers to the FBI Cryptanalysis Unit. The Bureau's track record with these codes is surprisingly poor. Internal documents openly admit that the very first cipher was cracked by a civilian before the FBI even finished processing it. And for the remaining 3, the lab completely failed. The specific code referenced in the TV producer's email is the infamous Z340. This diagram shows a grid of exactly 340 blank cells that rapidly populate with abstract, incomprehensible symbols. It represents a cryptographic wall that no one has bypassed. Decades of failure have turned the Z340 into a professional obsession for the lab. When a TV producer claims to have the answer, the claim is deeply personal and highly scrutinized. The producers send over their cipher work, and the FBI lab's internal response is surprisingly eager. Agents reply directly, stating, "Thanks so much, that's exactly what we needed to see." But the producers have a condition for sharing more. They want an on-camera interview with an FBI expert, and they submit a specific list of 10 questions to guide the discussion. This document, titled Questions Z340, acts as an informal interrogation of the FBI's codebreakers. It forces the Bureau to confront the Zodiac mythology. Specifically, asking if he was self-taught or had a military background. Media inquiries like this have a unique effect. They force the Bureau to take assumptions that usually sit buried in cold case files and officially articulate them into a documented consensus. An agent drafts unvarnished answers in this internal document. Regarding Zodiac's military background, the answer is an unambiguous no. Nothing aligns with military cryptography. Was he self-taught? They confirm it, yes. On tracking other agencies' attempts, they admit they could only speculate. The FBI's own files strip away the supervillain myth. The Zodiac wasn't a highly trained tactical genius. He was a chaotic, lucky amateur. Moving away from the thrill of cryptanalysis, the correspondence dissolves back into administrative red tape. A cautious email dance begins between the FBI's Public Affairs Office and the TV producers. Despite agreeing with the producer's research direction, the FBI is extremely hesitant to associate its brand with a sensationalized television documentary. The Bureau ultimately sets a highly restrictive condition for providing their insights to the show: total anonymity. They agree to provide insight on background, not on camera. These internal drafts offer a profile that challenges the popular myth of the Zodiac mastermind. By keeping these assessments on background, the Bureau allows the more sensational public narrative to go largely unchecked. The emails wrap up with a negotiation over scheduling logistics. Ultimately, the FBI retreats back into the shadows of the Quantico lab, leaving the media to tell the story on their own. The world's most sophisticated intelligence apparatus found itself stymied for decades by the unrefined, chaotic scribbles of a self-taught amateur. Despite the TV production hype and the FBI's blunt internal assessments, the Z340 remains exactly what it was when it arrived: a haunting, unresolved anomaly sitting untouched in the federal archives.